Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight's symposium organized by FAME Collective to expose the barriers in architecture education from a FAME perspective, which I, on behalf of the Architectural Association, am delighted to be hosting. To tell you a bit about FAME, it's both an acronym and an ambition in this case, standing for Female Architects of Minority Ethnic Backgrounds, but also representing the ambition to shed greater light on truly excellent, passionate, and incredible practitioners, educators, critics, and more within the expansive field of architecture. The collective has done incredible work to date in both celebrating the successes of women from what's termed as ethnic minorities in architecture, but also exposing the barriers they face through the narratives of their lived experiences. And this symposium will continue in that vein as we hear from both FAME Collective on their recent student survey, as well as 3 leaders in the field in the first half of the event, which will also leave us time in the second half to discuss more informally in breakout rooms about each of our experiences of barriers in education and how we can learn from each other in how to surmount these different obstacles. The aim of the event is to better understand how architectural education is experienced by individuals of all backgrounds and to inspire professionals, educators, and students of architecture to bring positive change for future generations. Initiatives and groups like FAME Collective are so important in how they operate outside of institutions, but equally hold them to account in order to shape a more inclusive future for architectural practice and education alike. But equally, it's important that institutions support their objectives in tackling issues of race and gender, and we all work together to achieve these much overdue aims. So while we all still have a long way to go towards this, it's great that this event is a cross-institutional collaboration with both the AA and RIBA hosting the event, with the ARB's support to link to their own survey on a similar topic that Rebecca will speak more about later this evening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Manisha Verghese, and I'm the head of the AA's public program. And to briefly introduce some of the initial presenters this evening in the order that they'll be speaking in, Marsha Ramroop has been working inclusively throughout her career. Prior to joining the RIBA as Director of Inclusion and Diversity, she was influential with inclusion efforts at the BBC alongside her work in radio, as well as working in her own private diversity and inclusion practice, titled Unheard Voice Consultancy Limited. She's a leader in cultural intelligence in the UK, helping organizations deliver strategic inclusive change. Then Rebecca Roberts-Hughes is a Policy and Communications Director at the Architects Registration Board, or ARB, leading cross-organizational policy development and external engagement, and is helping to embed equality, diversity, and inclusion across all of the ARB's external activities. Throughout her career, she's worked in policy, research, and communication roles spanning regulation, housing, and architecture. And then, of course, Tumpa, who probably needs no introduction as the founder of FAME Collective, who I've been delighted to get to know over the course of organizing this event, and is also giving a lecture as part of our new models series later this term in December, which I encourage all of you to attend. So Tumpa Husna Yasmin Fellows is an architect, design researcher, a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Architecture, and an architectural design tutor at the London School of Architecture, as well as at Central St. Martin's. In addition to founding FAME Collective, she is co-founder of Our Building Design and the charity Manan Foundation Trust. And you can read longer bios for all of our participants this evening on our website. So now Marsha will say a few words to introduce the RIBA's involvement in this symposium, followed by Rebecca, who will speak about an upcoming ARB survey on the same topic. And then Tumpa will tell us more about FAME and the presentations and discussions to follow. So please join me in welcoming them to the AA. And Marsha, over to you.
Thank you so much. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Discrimination in architecture education is evident in the data. Sometimes discrimination for individuals is deliberate, but it's inherent systemic concerns that lead to year after year women from underrepresented racialized groups feeling like they can't continue in their education in architecture academia or through the profession, and excuses are made and reasons are given. But we all know there's nothing wrong with the women. It's clearly the system. And what the brilliant FAME Collective is doing here is uncovering and highlighting the system. And by recognizing the system, we can start to pull apart the behaviors, the attitudes, the processes that support the system, so we can bring about change. And the data piece is really quite a significant part of monitoring and telling that story. And that's why the RIB is involved, because we need to see that data, to monitor the story so that we can bring about the change. Michelle Obama, in her autobiography, she speaks the way that she's had to fight through perceptions and discrimination and racism and sexism. An amazing person forced to deal with these issues. And you don't even have to look that far. Smita Singh, Annette Fisher, the women in this evening's panel, brilliant women, made to feel less than. Why? Why? You know, this is the question that drives me. Do you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? May you shoot me with your words. May you cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. And it's okay to feel frustration and anger and at times despondency and desperate, because then how else do we know that there's an injustice to fight? And this is it. This is the work. There may not be any intention on the part of those who allow these outcomes to transpire. And yet, here it is, the evidence, the outcomes, the impact. And it's beholden upon us all in the profession, the ARB as a statutory organisation and the RIB as a professional body, to work together with all to tackle it. It's all well and good acknowledging and saying, yes, but these figures lay bare the reality in people's lives. And whilst it may feel personal to them when this research is laid at the feet of those in charge, it's not so personal to them. Those in charge can afford to step back, work through any bias, defensiveness, and discomfort, and take this data, showing systemic discrimination and the stories of personal woe, and run with it to create change, remembering it is personal for those who are affected. And this is the work that I'm doing at the RIBA. Out of the huts of history, shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I'm the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. So we must work together, support each other, elevate each other. We must organise and amplify voices. Still, we rise. Thank you, Maya Angelou, for inspiration. Thank you, FAME Collective, for your work exposing the barriers in architecture education. Rebecca Roberts of the ARB, over to you.
Great, thank you, Marsha. That was fantastic. I've woken up even more than the coffee that I've just drunk in preparation for this. So thank you for inspiring passion today. And thank you to all of you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be supporting FAME and its aims for a more inclusive future. Those of you who don't know what the Architects Registration Board is about, we are the independent regulator of the architect's profession, and we're accountable to government. And we have some core functions that are set out in law. Part of what we do is approving the qualifications that are required for people to become architects and join the Architects Register. And we also set the standards of conduct and practice for architects and investigate any complaints for people who fall below those standards. So the aim here is that when anybody uses an architect, they can be reassured and confident that that person is suitably well trained and qualified. So we've been looking at how we regulate recently, and we've recently launched a new strategy and several different programs, one of which I wanted to talk to you about tonight because I'm hoping it links in with the work you're doing and the research that I'm looking forward to hearing more about this evening. So we want to regulate in a way that helps the sector in responding to key challenges, including safety and climate change, amongst others. And we want to help develop a profession that reflects the communities in which it works. The basic premise here is that if the architecture profession is going to design for different types of communities and people who live different types of lifestyles, that profession should really be drawn from those different communities and lifestyles as well. So that's part of what we're aiming for. But we have a long way to go before we get there. So you may have seen the report that we launched earlier on this year, which found that only 1% of the Architects Register identifies as Black and only 29% are women at the moment. So this is obviously something that we would like to help change. And we believe that ARB can make the biggest difference to this through using the specific powers that we have through our statutory role. And possibly one of the most important projects is our review of the initial education and training of architects, meaning we're reviewing the way that we've set up a regulatory framework for approving the qualifications that people need to be able to become architects. This is probably the most important project when it comes to the future of the profession, and we're trying to create a truly representative profession through the work we're going to be doing. So at the moment, ARB sets criteria and processes that institutions teaching architecture must meet in order for their students to qualify and register as architects. However, we've done some research and quite a lot of engagement with the profession, and our evidence suggests that the existing educational model of parts 1, 2, and 3 is inflexible and costly and is in need of modernisation. So we want to consider how and when specialism is needed and create a system that would deliver effective and attractive pre-registration work experience. And we also want the schools to be able to teach the curriculum that works for them and stay up to date. So there's new solutions and new learnings emerging all the time in areas like climate change. We want the schools to have the flexibility under our regulatory system to stay up to date and teach the most relevant stuff. So the system, as it currently stands, has produced thousands of architects who are absolutely excellent, and some of you are on the line today. But we've also heard, including from colleagues in FAME, that the cost of education and the requirements for work experience can create barriers for people from less affluent backgrounds or without existing networks within the profession. So to put it really bluntly, as the regulator, we don't want access to the architect's profession to rely on having money or to rely on nepotism. It should be about your skills, your training, your educational background, and how you've got there. So we have a vision of how we're going to do this. We want to change the regulatory model to focus on outcomes that are required of somebody at the end of their initial education and training. So the focus is going to be on what a newly qualified architect should be able to do, not the route by which they got there. And this means we're considering different and new routes to registration, new routes into the profession, which hopefully will help to improve access. So we've set out some proposals at a really early stage, and we published those a couple of weeks ago. And before we continue down the path that we've set ourselves, we want to stop in our tracks, test it with people, and see what you all think. So we've launched a survey, which I'll put a link to the chat in a moment. And we want to hear your views on our proposals, on the vision for success, and on the potential removal of parts 1, 2, and 3, and how a new structure might work. The survey is going to close on the 10th of January, and then we're going to do a proper analysis of it, read every single response. We've already got nearly 300, so we're gearing up for a busy January. We want to hear what everybody has said. We'll do a proper analysis of it. We'll publish everything we've heard, and then we'll move into the next phase of that work and design what that new education and training systems should look like. So my plea today is that I would love you all to complete the survey, to share it amongst your networks. We really want to hear from all of you. This seminar is about the barriers. I'm going to be listening in and learning, hopefully, but please do tell us what you think. Please do help us get the system right in the future. Thank you very much. I'll stick the links in the chat, and back to you, Timper.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'd like to start by sharing my screen. You can just see my presentation. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, sorry about this, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking Manijay, Raj, and the team at the AA who are behind the scenes to make this happen, and for hosting this event and for your enormous support. And I'd also like to thank Marsha from the bottom of my heart, from the RIBA, for your time and for your support, and for our discussions and our collaboration. And also towards Fame Collective's research, which, as you know, is trying to expose the barriers in architectural practice and also architecture education. And the research, which is a 3-year long research, is partly funded by the RIBA Research Fund. I'd also like to thank Rebecca for your support. And so, yes, it's great to be able to have conversations with both the RIBA and the ARB to help to support us to facilitate the voices of the underrepresented and to really understand why the system is not working for everybody, and to investigate why women, especially women from underrepresented communities, lack representation in architecture. So this symposium will explore the barriers in architecture through listening from our keynote speaker and our speakers to panel speakers, as well as we will be going into smaller breakout rooms, which will facilitate one-to-one conversations, which we hope to provide a safe space for the participants. And please note that breakout rooms will be completely anonymized, and we do not publish the recording of the breakout room. So feel free to be as open and honest in your discussions in the breakout room to really share your stories of the barriers and why you think architecture education hasn't worked for you or isn't working for you. So just a little bit of Fame Collective. I think Marsha and Manijay already discussed what I wanted to say, but yeah, so our aim is to celebrate the successes of the ethnic minority women in architecture, and also to expose the barriers that face through their narrative of their lived experiences. This participatory research symposium focuses on the pathways to success and the challenges they have overcome in architecture education. Through this lens, we'll review the systemic inequality and expose the barrier for a FAME student while they study architecture in the UK. FAME's research aims to shine a light on the challenges and inequalities in architecture education through lived experiences of the barriers in architecture education. And we hope to inspire the professionals, the educators of the architecture institutions to bring positive change for future generations of FAME and to help create an inclusive architecture profession to address the underrepresentation of FAME in architecture. The event is part of a series of events which will be documented and shared with institutions and those who, I guess, make policies and have the ability to make a change. So, and we would like to highlight the inequality that exists. So our symposium will consist of the keynote speaker, as I said, and 2 panel speakers and participants addressing the subject. And the first half of the event will consist of listening from the speakers, and also after we hear from the speakers, Fame Collective will be sharing a video which summarizes our findings from the student survey we have circulated in the UK architecture institutions throughout the months of July and September this year. and the aim of the survey was to capture the quiet, famed student voices, sharing their lived experiences, and to amplify it at this symposium. We want to include as many voices as possible. So yeah, please, it's therefore in the second half of the event, please join in and amplify your voice and share your stories. And yeah, just to reiterate, your name will not be revealed, and you can switch off your camera, or we will not publish any of the recordings, so you'll be anonymized. And then, so before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to briefly present what we've been up to since FAME first started just over a year ago. And the main presentation will show the published research that we have been able to collate. Also, we have a poll. So if the poll appears on your screen, please take a moment to answer the questions. That would be much appreciated. So if I now turn to my presentation. So here are some of the faces that are involved in our project. And so we are very fortunate to have many, many volunteers who kindly give up their time in trying to help us amplify the quiet voices and to understand the barriers in architecture. So please join us. The more there are of us, the louder our voices will be. Just a quick timeline to understand where we are. So we are here. So we are in our third research symposium, and the first two were really focusing on these following research questions. So what are the barriers in architecture as a practitioner? And the third one is today's event. We'll be focusing just on architecture education. And we'd also like to be able to answer, how can a female architect or minority ethnic be supported to overcome these barriers in architecture, in academia, and in practice? Yeah, so our method of our research is participatory research symposiums, and we listen to our participants and our speakers to generate discussions, and we transcribe those, and then we go into analytical discussions. So this is our second event. So the first one was hosted by Architecture Foundation, and the second one was hosted by the NLA, and today's one is hosted by AA and the RIBA. So after we've analysed what we discussed in our first symposium, these are some of the things at high level that's come up. So we identified the issues that the participants have discussed. They said it was the barriers that they think fall under racism, gender, lack of racial and gender diversity in architecture, class, socioeconomic background, cost of architecture education, narrow structure and framework of architecture curriculum, which is some identify as non-inclusive, narrow structure and framework of architecture profession, and identity in architecture, Western language or representation of architecture, age, religious belief, ability, lack of access to information about architecture for prospective students of architecture from underrepresented communities, lack of connection in the profession impacts the confidence of those who face these barriers, and architecture industry impacted by the economic activities and structural barriers. So once we gathered some of the lived experience, we also wanted to know the data and wanted to analyze against the data what the situation is in terms of in the architectural field, in terms of ethnicity of architects and in terms of the gender. So these are some of our graphs that we produced from the ARB annual reports, and as you can see, that is dominated by white British architects for the registration of architects, and in this data has come from the RIBA annual report, and as you can see, it's working in different direction depending on what race you are. So if you start off somebody from white background, it seems like by the time you get to part 1 and 3, we have more architects from white background, but it's the opposite. If you are from other ethnic minority groups, you tend to drop out. So you never make it to part 3. And that's worse for Black and Asian students. So when we put the data together, we realized actually, although this is quite helpful to show that male and female differences in registered architects and also ethnic minorities or ethnicity, but there is no data that shows what is the difference between male and female and their ethnic backgrounds, which we hope to find through working with the ARB, hopefully, and the RIBA. So I'm going to end my presentation, but some of the recommendations from our keynote speaker from the first symposium was, I'm just going to read out some of the quotes, as our research is mainly extracting lived experiences through people's quotes. So what can we do to remove the barriers? So the first thing is education. We need to have education. The curriculum needs to be decolonized. We need to actually know what are the issues in order to tackle them. Secondly, we need to have empathy. Thirdly, empower people who haven't got power, and make sure if you're saying you're employing people from non-white backgrounds, they're not HR managers or secretaries or admin assistants. So we are very happy to share our research. So feel free to go on our website, and there's a link for our research report, which analyzes the current data in terms of race and gender in architecture, and also the lived experiences that we found. So yes, I think, and then we transcribe all the quotes, but we do not reveal who said what, so you can have confidence and speak freely. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to now introduce, I'm going to turn to the speakers. So first of all, I'd really like to thank our brilliant speakers for their for their kindness, for their time, and for their sharing their experiences. And we're delighted to have Dr. Tanya Singupta as the keynote speaker, Felicity Atekpe for our panel speaker, and Dr. Constance Lau for the third panel speaker. So if I can turn to Tanya. So Dr. Tanya Singupta is an associate professor and director of architectural history and theory at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. Her work focuses on post-colonial transcultural histories of South Asia and on marginalized narratives. Her research on paper, bureaucracy, and Clark's life worlds in relation to British colonial office architecture in India received the 2019 RIBA President's Award Medal for Research. Dr. Sengupta is co-chief editor of the journal Architecture Beyond Europe and co-curator of the recent curriculum Race and Space, What is Race Doing in a Nice Field Like the Built Environment? So yes, I'd like to welcome Tanya Sengupta. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Tumpa, and thank you all of you. I mean, it was fantastic, and including Marsha's absolutely sort of hair-raising poetry was a really fitting start, and that will be a really tough act to follow. I think almost anything after that I say is going to sound much more mechanical. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Okay, is that visible?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm speaking to the theme that FAME and RIBA, ARB, and I mean the number of people actually gathered together behind the scenes when we met up was actually really large, and that itself, just the sheer number of people even organizing these, it kind of goes to show a kind of a critical mass coalescing around these questions. So I'll share some of the thoughts on some of my thoughts on this sort of theme, and mainly as an architectural historian and someone who is an educationist. Basically, I teach and do research at the Bartlett. And okay, so I was born and grew up in Calcutta, and this is the type of environment that I grew up in. And literally the pictures at the bottom left and on the right are the kinds of neighborhoods I actually spent time in. And then I went to do my architecture degree in Calcutta, and then went on to do an urban design degree in Delhi. I worked in the profession, and as is usual for architects, I started teaching part-time, then teaching full-time. I had pretty long years in architectural and urban design practice, and then kind of moved into teaching academics, and then came here to do my PhD. And most of the practices I worked in had a very strong social kind of orientation. They were not really the classic mainstream practices in any case, and which in a way was very deeply ingrained in me in some ways, that kind of that orientation. And also, this is very much my neighborhood in Calcutta. And other than the city itself, these are the type of people who, along the way, I started noticing and sort of taking cognizance of more and more. These are mothers waiting in the school break, waiting to pick up their children. And on the left-hand side is a domestic female worker going past. And this is sometime in an afternoon in Calcutta. And what you see here is also the residues of the biggest sort of annual festival, the Durga Puja. It's a very typical sort of Bengali festival in that part of India. And so these sort of residues of cultural landscapes, but also how women found a place within actually using barely minimal infrastructure. And in fact, scholars like Swati Chattopadhyay uses this expression of spatial imagination, that it takes a certain amount of spatial imagination to imagine a capacity in a built environment which is not directly geared towards women or designed for them. Okay, I grew up in a very colonial city, Calcutta, and in an ex-colony, and my PhD was on provincial towns. So I kind of went away from the metropolitan area. So in a way, I was very interested in sort of margins of margins, so to say, margins even within colonial landscapes and interior areas. So I looked at provincial architecture and urbanism in 19th century Eastern India, and I did that from University of Westminster, and then got a job and moved to the Bartlett. And you can see at the bottom, I just put the two of them together, partly not so much for the contrast, but the contrast is quite obvious in the kind of world I dwelt in and the kind of world I was studying, and then the world I now sort of inhabit. But equally, also partly because, I wanted to minimize the number of slides, but the juxtaposition is also kind of telling, I think. Okay, so in a way, I'll be speaking as a historian, researcher, and the field of history and the world of education and how I think of people and within that, within the field. So the self, the field, and the kind of people and the protagonists that actually occupy that space. So one thing that I found very, which was a real revelation when I came here, was that, obviously Britain has this deep imperial past, and this is Bristol as a slave port, or its imperial colonial possessions. So this is the urban scheme of Imperial Delhi in the 1930s on the right-hand side. Or if one looks at World War I, the African conscripted labor, which served the British during the East Africa campaign. So imperial linkages and colonial linkages are so so foundational to the delivery of the the project of Western capitalist modernity, and also much of architectural history. Yet this very white patriarchal, colonial, imperial, and racial basis of Western modernity and much of architectural history, on the one hand, it's so obvious and it's so dwelt upon, especially at least in history, the field of history itself. But I found this quite a paradox that it seemed to have pretty scant presence in architectural history, or the kind of imagination of architectural history in Britain. So there was a kind of a cognitive absence, and I was very saddened by it because, coming from the colony, of course, the colonial relationships was highly problematic and hierarchical, but you at least think there's a relationship. And then you suddenly realize that, at least within my architectural history fraternity, there was very little of those connections, save for, stray. I came into Westminster, and Samir, who I think is probably part of the audience today, he was running a really interesting architecture, globalization, cultural identity program. So there were these islands within which these were being dealt into, but it didn't figure as a kind of mainstream discourse in architectural history at all, and doesn't even now. And what I felt was that there were certain patterns of the engagement, if there was one. One was that architectural historians would be interested in mainly sort of Western European or American figures going into colonies. So architects, for instance, whether it is in the colonial times, the genesis of tropical architecture, or for instance, architecture of humanitarian aid, say post-war formations around the United Nations, World Bank, and that structure of a dispersion of architectural expertise. A lot of it came through the language of technology transfer. So this was one kind of, and in some ways, to me, it seemed akin to a kind of colonial journey from the metropole into the interiors. So even the scholarship seemed to be doing something like that, quite a lot of it, not all of it. I need to always qualify. The other was that when so-called other histories of other parts of the world, or people who sort of fell into the crevices of this mainstream history, when that was engaged with, it often was through the paradigm of white Western capitalist modernity. So the markers of modernity would be industrial modernity. So even if it's Africa being discussed, it was about the marker of modernity was when the railroad is constructed. So the paradigms seem to be basically the framework seemed to remain the same. So the empirical context change, and this is also this, to me, quite problematic use of these other kinds of contexts, which are always considered empirical and sort of sites to demonstrate or sort of Western concepts and ideas. The other was, of course, the ex-colony itself, and they became the sort of quintessential sites for narratives of, slums, and that ever since the collapse and the withdrawal of colonial rule, that these societies sort of descended into complete collapse and sort of corruption, disorganization. They basically epitomized all the disorders of modernity in the ex-colony, but and in the metropolitan context, post-colonial metropolitan context, like, say, for instance, London or any of the bigger cities in Britain and in Europe and America, the narratives of the immigrant, the migrant, the women and of women of color, their experiences and landscapes were somehow seen as ethnic cultural practices and the realm of the banal, the everyday, not quite architecture. So history had these sort of underpinnings, at least, these are the fragments that I was encountering all the time. Then there was also this thing of, and in this gradient, obviously, the woman of color is sort of located in a highly extreme position. Okay. And of course, the linkage between architecture and the realm of architecture, built environment, and colonialism and its representational systems is actually pretty direct. So this is Edward Said's famous book Orientalism, and even though it's sort of by now almost cliched, but ironically, a lot of it still holds good. So Said's basic thesis for people who may not be familiar with Said was that the whole idea of the Orient was a construction of the West, and the quintessential sort of symbolic figure of this was the Western depiction of the Oriental or the non-Western. And Oriental didn't just mean the East. It started with the idea of the East, but essentially anything other than the West, so the non-West. It was the figure of the woman that actually sort of epitomized this, and entire lands would also be described in these either exotic feminine terms or as problematic, difficult, jungly. And this translation is kind of almost blatant in Corbusier's work on Algiers, for instance, where he's literally depicting an entire land and an entire sort of settlement as this figure of the Oriental woman, who the Western architect's hand sort of delicately holds. So there's this whole sort of patriarchal relationship established through representations like this. And of course, as you can see on the left, it is always a relationship of difference. So the kasbah or the native settlement is always bypassed because it is different, and that difference is continuously inscribed. So and one of the key ways in which some of the recovery has happened in more recent times is this whole notion of inclusion. And I think inclusion is obviously highly important, inclusion of narratives and inclusion of stories of other parts of the world, stories of female authors. But equally, this we need to be kind of wary of inclusion alone. Because often these render these into realms that need to be studied, realms of application and not from where paradigms are generated. And one of the things Sarah Ahmed, for instance, a feminist and decolonial queer race and feminist scholar, talks about is this whole idea of academic footnoting. How many women of color actually get footnoted in our classic sort of institutional academic publications? The idea also of white knowledge being highly portable. So that applies both in terms of, for instance, white historians, especially white male historians. I would say, yeah, in fact, very much more of white male historians can go and do histories of places all over the world, but the reverse is not really true. That same entitlement is not really offered to a non-Western scholar. And there's also a matter of actual mobility. Being able to travel needs money and the kind of privileges which is not always afforded to a non-Western scholar. And then the non-Western knowledge and histories is always seen to be located. So I work on South Asia, and I work on South Asia for a reason. One of the reasons why I work on it is because I can read the vernacular archives. I don't have to only read the colonial archives. I can actually, therefore, generate stories from the below, so to say. Also things like, totalizing claims. Often white Western historians would have book titles which are, say, architecture and it's a kind of a global claim, whereas we would really think so many times before making those sort of claims. And one of the things that I personally feel very affected by is this idea of a glass ceiling. That is, many areas are beyond the reach of a non-Western, especially female scholar of color. Whereas the reverse is not true. And this has a deep genealogy in colonialism, where the West had through the networks of global circulation, the West had the apparatus to write histories of other places and the power to narrate. And that power to narrate is non-reciprocal. Dipesh Chakraborty mentions this idea of non-reciprocity, irrespective of the fact that I guess, in fact, most scholars of color have actually made great efforts at learning and actually, keeping up with Western scholarship. The other thing is that this idea that, educators also have a right to learn, because when we teach in a specialized field, but we also do a lot of generalized teaching. So we have very specialized research, which we teach about, but we also work in a larger discursive broad field, and that malleability to be able to do that versatility is quite core to a tutor skill, because you can't just do your own very specific expert realm of work, but it's always about how does that connect to a broader field or other fields. And I have often found that while, for instance, my really interesting and great colleagues, actually, and I've learned huge amounts from them, are able to learn about post-colonialism or teach alongside, but the reverse is not always afforded to us. Then there's, of course, Sarah Ahmed talks about the whole idea of diversity work, and her absolutely iconic work on being included, on complaint. The labor that actually goes into this is very often put in by women and women of color by far. I mean, we at the moment have this in the School of Architecture BAME Awards Gap addressing team, and we are working on a project. We got some funding, and other than two, all our women. Almost 100% of the women of color are present in that group. So all the volunteering is happening from women and women of color. And the two men are from other kinds of marginalized minorities. So one mixed race person, one LGBTQ person. So of course, and our frames of reference, whether it's external examiners, international lectures, also the sheer number of ethnic minority staff as kind of not just for staff, but also as orientating factors for students. And the other challenge I find is that kind of having to kind of move between different kinds of selves, both collaborating and conflicting. So on the one hand, I have some direct affective experience and I feel bad about some things, or I feel sad, or, there are actual visceral kind of experiences. And I think must be the overwhelming majority of all experiences many of us would have felt, many on this platform, definitely. Then there's a kind of an intellectual processing, because I work on post-colonialism and decolonization. So I'm sort of processing and also reading, actually. And, there's a lot to read and keep up with. And it's a highly agile field, actually. And then participating in policy change and trying to initiate those. So all these require different kinds of skills and the kind of application and different kinds of modes of engagement. And I often find that very challenging. And so when I'm having to do some kind of an intellectual task, I'm actually feeling maybe emotionally really affected, so, and these are not separate and they feed each other, but they are also quite challenging to, I felt that to move from one to the other, or to be able to, that we are expected to do all of it. In terms of students' experience, I'm hoping that a lot of it will be gathered when we meet students. And I used to do a student well-being role for 5 years and have had quite close, I've basically gathered vignettes from what students told me. And I also had very detailed conversations with some of my female students of color. And some of the and what strikes me is, in a way, Spivak's idea of her iconic essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? But one of the things she kind of highlights is this idea of almost subaltern of the subalterns. The woman of color is subject to patriarchy both by men of color as well as white men. So so that there are different points of confrontation and subjection that this figure is subject to. And in case of students, that really seems to be there's this kind of deep intersectionality. There's the student. Being a student puts students in a certain power equation, in a gradient, which is they are vulnerable. Then being a woman and being a racialized figure, then of course add to that all other forms of intersectional marginalities, cultural context, class, sexual orientations, ability, disability, their familial social locations, and how you are expected to be a mother, you are having to study, manage your child, really challenging kind of constellations. A key thing that all the students I had very detailed chats with, all of them, I think one point they talked about was a kind of sense of identification, that architectural explorations related to their heritage are not spoken to in the class. And in that sense, they don't have, and if they choose to work on, something to do with what they understand as their heritage, it's not a free space because it's not a populated realm. It's a pocket. So there are very few, and so this whole feeling of a kind of lone journey and being isolated and not supported by tutors, because often the tutors are not equipped to speak to them. It's not that the tutors are ill-meaning. Some students told me that their tutors were extremely empathetic, but they simply couldn't speak to the issues concerned because of, and it's not obviously possible for everyone to know everything, but it's also definitely a key indicator of the sheer lack of enough of ethnic minority staff with the types of expertise that would help in establishing these real connections with students. Minority ethnic students who identify more closely with each other, because we do have a substantial number, but these are very misleading because we have a lot of overseas students. Their experience is very different, and very different kinds of marginalization from so-called home students. And home and overseas, these are sort of institutional categories. We do need to actually really think about the difference of experiences and therefore how to address them. But equally, they are not. It's beyond these institutional categories, the layers of subjectivity. So that whole range is actually very important. But equally, people, therefore, who actually identify more closely with each other are actually scattered about. Unit systems, for instance, means many students said first year we felt that we were sort of together, we held together, and then we sort of got scattered. So this diffusion and kind of loss of critical mass. And of course, the understanding of often of students as ethnic minority women, as well as ethnic minority students in general, less able. And in case of women, for instance, the extremes of aggressiveness, the loud African student and the passive student, infantilization, and kind of in need of help. All these are sort of colonial tropes, and they very much affect behavior towards these students. Also often feed into things like awarding gap. So one of the points to, I guess, keep in mind is to think about coalescing as sort of a resistance to whiteness, but equally keeping in mind this heterogeneity. And the other thing is that, for instance, language barriers or writing barriers, some of it is carried, say overseas students face this, some overseas students face this more than others, but also home students maybe. It's also the privileges which are taken for granted, posh public school education, posh sort of private school education, and the kind of competence that goes with it, which are just taken for granted for privileged students, are often not available to to ethnic minority students. And if there are issues to do with language, because history and theory obviously deals with language and languages and text, but I've realized that it does require tutors to put in, there is a greater onus on tutors to put in a bigger job of being able to hear and listen. And I have mostly found that I've discovered that if one goes beyond that language question, it needs more work. But there's a wealth of things I learned from the students and insights that students apparently not competent with language actually have to offer. So the ability to hear is key. Data, I'm extremely, the data is very weak so far, and I'm not going to go into that. And you guys are doing incredible work. Also, of course, the AGES and ARB and I think FAME's work would be extremely useful, invaluable. The role of data can't be undermined. I've mentioned awarding gap, and awarding gap is often seen as students gap, and there's a kind of prefigured scale of often marking. Ethnic minority student, okay, high 60s, but not quite a 70. So there's a kind of prefiguration into marking scales often. So obviously conscious, unconscious bias, but I think a deeper question is, what is it that we value in an essay? So is it, what sort of experiences, what sort of narratives do we value? And that's a fundamental question. And I think we need to address those. The other thing is this whole idea of heroic designs, and I think it in 2007 or 2000, I think they kind of took stock at the Bartlett and found that women were sort of regularly scoring lower, that the top was never women, and then mostly it was white male students at the top. And they realized that there was this thing about sort of heroic, spectacular, complex, like stupendous designs. I'm not saying that tendency's gone away, but this was then realized that women are often actually working on smaller scale, more granular, more textured, often engaging with everyday worlds. And these are valued differently. So just for some stories of hope, I know I've taken quite long. This was an exhibition curated by Izaskun Chinchilla. She's a really interesting feminist architect. Many of you may know of her. And this was an exhibition called Cosmo Women, which basically gathered together about 65 female students' work of the last 10 years. And 2021 was the exhibition, and 18 female architects and educators wrote about them. So it was a sort of all women project. Then I myself, what do? I teach postcolonialism, decolonization. So this is actually sort of really looking at it analytically and trying to figure out the sources, the conceptualizations, the theories, the unpacking in a kind of quite an intellectual task of it in that sense. But on the other hand, so this is where one unpacks what went on. So the job of unpacking, and but also how does one decolonize, and the intellectual basis. But equally, I teach generalized seminars where I'm not teaching postcolonialism, partly not to be continuously slotted only as a South Asianist and a postcolonialist. So my seminar is called Architecture as Spatial and Cultural Practice. This is my 4th year seminar. I teach postcolonialism in some other part so in different parts of the school, I teach different things. In one, I teach specialized seminars on postcolonialism, decolonization. But in the other, I have decided, no, I am not going to teach something called architecture and race or architecture and postcolonialism, but I'll teach architecture as spatial and cultural practice, where I use both postcolonial theory, but also various other kinds of theory and a lot of empirical work. And I never teach anything without referring to other contexts, practices, paradigms. So in a way, I've told myself, I'm not going to teach anything with that. So this is where you teach something quite general, but basically it's shot through with these questions. But that's not the only thing it's shot through. And the job of unpacking and reconstructing, so people like Huda, Susie Holt, Tandy Lowenson's pioneering work on race-based architecture, they were, I guess, the first to actually do this systematic academic unpacking and sort of propositional work on race-based architecture. Then we did this collaborative work again across the faculty, and you can see it's a highly mixed group of people. We also had Solomon, who's in the center, who's from a critical race theory background in Institute of Education. So this is Race and Space, what's race doing in a nice field like the built environment. It's an open source resource. I guess you may have seen it. Otherwise, I can post a link. New books like this, there are some critiques like, that it's too focused on America, but this is one of the first really kind of system, other than Leslie Locko's, and that's 20 years back, major intervention in the field. And we do need all the unpacking that we could have. So I'm reading a lot, but also a lot reading alongside with people, reading groups. These have become common. So a lot of it has become shared journeys. Need to narrate all these stories of lost stories of women who didn't get their full due in their time. Thinking of Lina Bobadi, Yasmin Lari. Also, it was quite interesting that, as Helen Lucas Architects, it says that this week the members of HLA had the privilege of hearing and meeting Yasmin Lari. So it's also speaking to, female-oriented practices. So there are all sorts of connections and sort of worlds being made here. Also work on immigrant communities, other kinds of landscapes. This is Shahid Salim's really fascinating history of the British mosque, and kind of looks at it from a very ground up approach, communities building for themselves in very ad hoc ways, but then getting organized and transformation of typologies. And again, a lot of the Westminster people would be familiar with it. One of my recent short pieces for the SHGB was called Looking for the Absent Women in the towns that I looked at for my PhD, but this was a separate work on thinking about the women, because they are not present. There are no autobiographies. There's textual evidence is very almost none. How do you methodologically address and find them in the spaces, in the architectures? Also, we need to, I think our task at hand is not just to improve our own position and experience, but to enable linkages between the architectural world and onto intersectional frames of women of color beyond academia, beyond architecture, to other contexts and subjectivities. I think we do have a role as sort of channels, and I won't say we can be their voice, because that's can be deeply problematic as well, but equally somewhere I think these sort of worlds which seem to have nothing to do with each other need to join up. Similarly, again, extraction and construction is one of the highest extraction-based industries. Yeah, so basically collectivities, affinities, alignments, numbers, proportions matter, coalesce, but also the granularity, the differentiations are also very important. It's not one whole big lump of minority ethnic women, but many kinds of subjectivities within that, and learn to learn and hear. This is what okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That was such a thought-provoking and inspiring discussions, and thank you for sharing all your research. So we will have, the audience will have moments to directly ask questions at the breakout room and later on in our program. We're running out of time slightly and would like to keep to the schedule in time. I know there's some people in the audience who'd like to really get involved in the breakout room. So I'm quickly going to turn to my next speaker, panel speaker, Felicity Atakpe. So Felicity is a practicing architect and the founder of White Table Architects, a practice in sustainable design, interiors, architecture, and landscape through enjoyment of the everyday, schemes of micro, small-scale housing, theatres and galleries. She's also a lecturer and has taught since 2000, having taught and examined extensively at the Bartlett, South Bank University, Greenwich University, Camberwell College of Art, Glasgow School of Art, and Cambridge University. She's currently the course leader for Interior Design Environment Architecture Ideas program at Ravensbourne University, London, and an external examiner for the new innovative Bartlett MSci architecture degree. Thank you, Felicity. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for turning up. I hope I will be quick, because actually the previous speaker touched on lots of issues that were of interest. So maybe I think what is useful is all that we can do is really talk about our experiences. And I think the strength of experience is listening to the different experiences and building that up in a way. And increasingly, I suppose, in my late middle age, almost dodderage, because I've started losing teeth and all sorts of things, I think it's important that there's visibility, that people can see other people that look like them doing the things they want to do. And hopefully, you know, they won't be perfect examples, but the fact that somebody is there means that you can do better. And I increasingly find that that's the role that I am maybe a little bit uncomfortably taking, but happily taking, because I'm hoping that the people that come after me will have an easier time, but will be better architects and designers, hopefully. So the Quaker in me says that I should start where I am. I grew up in my first 7 years in a real backwater in Western Africa, in a town, a seaside town, coastal town that is really now mostly underwater. So in fact, the house that I grew up in doesn't exist anymore. It's water. And I'm saying that because it means that I've always got the sustainability, etc., really there, because it's affected the things that I know and my memories. But I came here to a public school, a private school, at a very young age, and so was immersed in the education, I suppose, the privileged education system of this country. And I've always walked a funny line, because I feel like I've been on the inside, but I've also been on the inside of another place. And therefore I belong to both. I don't think that I would say I necessarily, visibly, people are always saying, where'd you come from? So I know that I clearly don't always belong here. But I find increasingly I don't really belong there either. So it's an interesting place to be. Added to that, my architectural education has been interesting for all the wrong reasons. I did really well at architecture school, but really the motivation for it was that when my father found out that I actually wanted to do architecture, he was so disgusted at the idea that I would waste my time doing such a ridiculously white middle-class activity that he said, I'm not going to pay for it. If you want to do it and you really want to do it, you go find out a way of doing it, but this is not going to be for me. Added to that, he said, nobody likes a clever girl and nobody certainly wants to marry an architect. So nobody will want you and I'll have wasted all my money and you're supposed to be a doctor. So that's where I started from. So I've had a very strange world through it, because on the one hand, I feel I sound different, and that has afforded some privileges, because architecture is, I think, undeniably a very middle-class, affluent activity to do. The fact that you don't get really much money for it in the end, that you need an address book. All these things are very pertinent and relevant questions. But I think the fact that I have made it through architecture school means that it should give everyone hope that you can actually make it through with those circumstances. So I didn't really know what it was, architecture, but I knew that I liked the idea of controlling the spaces I lived in, and that mostly it didn't seem to be designed for me. So I wanted to do something about it. Luckily, when I got to architecture school, it actually turned out to be something really interesting. I didn't know it was going to be interesting. It was just a thing that, because nobody I knew had ever done it. Nobody in my family, nobody that we knew was an architect. And, you know, my dad was right in a way, because his thing was that he couldn't help me in this task that I had wanted to. Whereas if I became a doctor or something, he knew doctors, he could help me along there. The other thing I think architectural education has taught me, and I will get to the point quickly, is that the places I find that talk about diversity and make a big show of it are usually some of the worst places to actually demonstrate these things. In my experience, the schools that I ended up with that were, it wasn't even mentioned. In a way, there was a much clearer way of dealing with it, because there wasn't any expectation on my side that things should be a certain way, because nobody had made any show of it. So I suppose the thing I want to say is that as an architect, a female architect, a Black female architect, a single parent female architect, I don't find that these things, they compound. They don't get any less. It doesn't get any reduced. And I find on a daily basis that it's a struggle. It's a struggle to do all those things and be in the built environment. And I think as educators, and I'm now in a position where hopefully I can set some of the agendas and facilitate change in the little bit of world that I'm in, that we all come with all our prejudices. And I think that the problem with architecture or the built environment is that somehow it always seems that, I don't know if it's the middle class thing or whatever it is, that some people inherently don't think they're prejudiced or it's their problem. They think, oh no, it can't be the Bartlett, it can't be Ravensbourne, because, you know, we're all good meaning and whatever. What they forget is that we all appear with ourselves, and we are, in fact, society. So anything you see on the screen is what's there. So as the students, and I find this is the truth for tutors, but also students, right? The prejudices on all sides. There is often the thing of aggression, talking as if you're aggressive because you have a point of view and you don't want to stop and not say what you mean. But I think, though, my son is in the background and it's half term, so forgive me. I think what I am most encouraged about recently, though, is that in a way, some of the discussions that have been maybe stopping, putting down in a way, seem to have gone out to the students I've seen. They're here and they want to be heard, and they will be heard. And I think if I can end here, I'm sorry, it's a very basic chat in a way. I think I'm really encouraged, and all I can do in a way is try and, in my little corner of architecture, make those voices mean something. And I can tell you that it isn't easy. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Felicity, for speaking from the heart and for sharing your inspirational journey. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next panel speaker, Dr. Constance Lau. Constance Lau is an architect and has taught architecture for over 2 decades, from undergraduate to doctorate level in London and Singapore. Research practice is applied through teaching, international workshops, conferences, peer reviews, and publishing. Her design studio's research interest in multiple interpretations and narratives are explored through the techniques of montage and different notions and allegory. The idea of a questioning and incomplete approach is fundamental. Central to the process-driven methodology is the role of dialogue with an emphasis on individual learning that encourages the students to assume authorship to shape the reading and outcome of the design brief. Thank you. Constance, over to you.
Hello, hi, all right, thank you. Thampa, thank you very much for inviting me onto this, okay. I think it was really inspiring to hear everybody talk about their experiences, and I've never really done it. So, okay, here we go. And I think I'll keep this very short because I think the breakout room is super important to get everybody to listen, to kind of share what they want to say. And I think Tanya covered a lot of the things that, was probably going through my head and my life. So, to sort of start and be very brief, I obviously, I studied in Singapore, and then I came over. I started my architecture education in Singapore, and then I came over to London to do the rest of it. And so I think from where I stand, the differences in from what I see and experience there, and the fact that I'm teaching back there and here is pretty stark. Okay, and why does it have to be? And for myself, I mean, all these years ago when I first came over, the whole idea, and of course, because Singapore was an RIBA accredited system, the whole idea of our colonial masters was already kind of in the picture. But the idea of the colonial gaze was a bit shocking. And I don't know whether it was because it was an assumption or because it was an assumption in association with me. So I remember, and I'll always save this bit of feedback. I submitted a paper once to talk about the colonial buildings in Singapore. And the feedback I got was, it's very eloquent, but why are you interested in describing the difficulties associated with colonial associations? I'm like, why am I interested in describing the difficulties associated with colonial associations? Huh? And then it goes on to soften and say, oh, perhaps you're doing it because it's easier since it's a very successful country. And I thought, you wouldn't be saying this to very many people, but you said it to me. Okay, so fast forward. So of course, I mean, there are barriers to within architecture education, and a lot of that has been articulated. And I think there are also barriers to and within wanting to be an architectural educator. So it's like a double whammy. Because you're in it and then you don't finish, and then you try to get in to be an educator, and it's not as easy. So again, the sort of representation and the kind of what you can bring to the table is also underrepresented. All right, so there you go. So when I first started, I said I won't share an image, but I'll share an image. Okay, so basically, so I started with wanting to talk about dialogue and design more as an academic pursuit, okay? But I've been teaching for 2 decades as Thampa has introduced, and gradually I realized that, no, it's not about that. The whole idea of multiple interpretations and challenging, ideas and challenging briefs is also woven into people's experiences. And I completely encourage my students to challenge conventions and assumptions and to empower them, okay, by encouraging them to bring their own experiences into the studio, into the conversations, into the proposals they want to do, so that they start, when they're in education. All right. I mean, the whole kind of budget and efforts and the kind of emphasis on climate change, right? The Wakefield models of the front loops and the back loops and antagonists versus protagonists. Why can't we do that to this? That this whole idea about discrimination or race, it's not a reaction, that we anticipate and we make positive actions. Okay. And I think the sooner the students that I teach, or the sooner the people who teach empower their students to discuss it in a kind of a safe, friendly, and very positive environment through design, to know that nothing is impossible. And I think the sooner we'll get, more people onto the table who are not angry, but are just saying, well, why not? And the fact that nothing is impossible. All right, that's from me.
Thank you so much, Constance. Thank you for speaking from the heart, and I really appreciate all your contribution. So now we're going to move to Fame Collective's video, which summarizes the student survey that we've circulated with the UK architecture institutions the last 3 months. So I'm going to hand over to Marie and the rest of the Fame Collective.
Hi, thanks, Timber. My name is Marie Nevin. I'm an architect at Stride Crown, and I'm based in Cardiff. As part of this research event, I was involved in putting together the questionnaire and reaching out to students at various institutions.
I am Lumi. I'm a third-year architecture student at the University of Bath. I joined Fame last summer, and I've been very inspired by the change we're creating.
I'm Grace. I recently joined Fame. I'm currently doing my part 2 at Cambridge. I was in charge of doing the video of the research project.
Hi, I'm Nabiha, and I'm doing my part 2 with Grace as well at Cambridge. And I was involved in the early stages of the research event preparation with the questions and the original social media posts.
Hello, my name is Vicky Carrillo. I'm a BA architecture student. I'm a BA architecture graduate, from University of Westminster. I've been helping and collaborating with Fame Collective, creating content for the collective social media platforms. And I've also helped with the marketing and the promotion of today's event.
We have gathered lived experiences of the barriers faced by female architects of minority ethnic while studying architecture in the UK. This video summarizes the results of the surveys that have been completed by Fame students and graduates of a range of universities across England, Wales, and Scotland.
Have you ever experienced barriers, felt uncomfortable, or felt like you didn't belong in your course due to your race or gender?
I've felt bothered by the attitudes of both staff and students towards foreign things, in the way that non-European architecture is taught and received as something different to European architecture, and the different treatment of international students, both patronising and dismissive.
I would say in the overall ratio of racial diversity, Black people were definitely underrepresented, and I felt the ratio of people of colour was drastically lower in my Part 3 course.
I don't really feel comfortable at uni. As a Muslim woman who wears a hijab and a minority at my university, I feel uncomfortable in certain situations where I'm doing group work with students on the minority race or religion. I struggle to express myself at times and be myself.
I had one design tutor who deliberately left me last in class for design tutoring. By then, it was always the end of the morning or afternoon, and therefore not enough time was allocated to me.
Do you have a Fame role model or a Fame mentor to help you in your journey in architecture? What was the gender and racial diversity like of staff and course mates, and did that affect you?
I don't have any architect role models because I can't identify with any architects we see, study, or hear about in the media in terms of race, gender, or even class.
I was fortunate to have a FAME tutor in my final year, and her presence was actually so reassuring. A woman of color who was also someone who raised a family, ran a practice, and was now tutoring too.
I've not met any FAME role models personally in practice, but I'm becoming more aware of FAME architects through networks such as FAME and webinars attended over this past lockdown year.
The gender of staff had a good balance, however senior staff were mostly male.
I have never had a FAME or even a male BIPOC tutor, which made it uncomfortable when working on design projects because I would feel like I had to adapt my design process to what was expected of me as a minority.
Were there challenging occasions when you wanted to leave architecture and study other degrees? If so, why did you feel this way? What made you change your mind, or how did you overcome the challenges to navigate through in your architecture education?
I found that working in practice is so much more enjoyable, which helped me continue through to qualifying as an architect.
The motivation to push barriers and champion my identity through architecture and be a FAME architect in an attempt to change the architecture field today.
I had such a bad experience. I still haven't returned to architecture after completing my part 2 and haven't completed my part 3.
At that time, I had a really difficult white male tutor who made me feel like crap, and I felt like I could never be an architect as I didn't understand his way of thinking. I'm really glad I didn't quit, as later I had a female tutor who was the best tutor I've ever had and changed my mind about studying architecture. I realized that my experience of the course was so dependent on the people leading the course and what they projected as architecture.
Due to the poor projections for women to progress in the industry, poor pay compared to other industries, requirement for expensive education to qualify, financially it took a lot of commitment and support from my family to reach qualification, as the Part 1 and 2 salaries are very low.
I felt all of my designs were more harshly critiqued due to my beliefs in the importance of community and togetherness, preventing me from creating fantastical architecture.
Were you ever advised against pursuing careers in architecture due to your gender and or background, during school or as a university student or graduate?
At my Part 3 oral exam interview, one of the 2 examiners was a woman, white British, who started the interview by remarking on my appearance. I am of mixed Lebanese, Romanian, Italian ethnicity, instead of focusing on my work. She proceeded to tell me that I was too ambitious, wanting to be a practicing architect, do a PhD, teach, and have hobbies. The message was that you can't have everything if you're a woman. You should give up your career. I cannot imagine anyone ever saying that to a man. Even though she gave me a low mark, my coursework was excellent, so I still got distinction.
I was always encouraged to do pharmacy or optometry, something shorter or more suited for females.
I was told numerous times that I will never become an architect because I'm a woman.
When it comes to design work and showing your work, there are tutors that don't even give you comments sometimes. And I don't think it was because of the quality of my work, but just because of the way I looked. And also because I was interested in traditional mud contradiction methods and I wasn't doing big, complex structures.
One of the teachers in my high school, her husband was an architect and she just didn't think it was for me or I was built for it. The comments were quite blunt.
How can the barriers be challenged? Or how could the educators address the barriers and support FAME students in architectural education?
Become well informed on their struggles, backgrounds, and identities. There is an ignorant nature towards the specific barriers that FAME individuals face that tutors fail to address because they haven't put in the effort to learn about it.
Carrying out lectures built within the course and outside, surrounding the topics of gender, racial diversity, and architecture.
They need to start actively giving examples and case studies done by female architects, LGBTQ architects, architects from different cultural backgrounds, so students other than the white straight ones can have examples of hope and success, as the experience and journey will be much harder and different to theirs.
Just give us the same opportunities and faith you have in your other students.
Ensure FAME are well represented in all modules and staff, including external tutors and critics. Reach out to students and provide a suitable support network if they need. Include in the curriculum for students to run school engagement events to encourage more students and young people from diverse backgrounds to study architecture.
As a student or practitioner, what message would you give to young FAME starting in or thinking about architecture school?
Don't fictionalize barriers, but also don't let actual barriers get in your way. You are strong and you can do better than you think.
There might be times where you feel isolated and out of place. Just remember you're not alone. Reach out to support groups and individuals who understand you. Make your voice heard. Don't fight on your own.
Just because you see this industry as an unbalanced sector doesn't mean you can't change it.
Don't give up, because you might be the role model for a person just like you who wants to pursue their dreams.
Talk to people who have been through it. I think I would have found that really helpful at the time, but I didn't know anyone. So take any opportunity that arises to speak to those who are further through school than you or practitioners. Don't take any negative things from tutors personally.
Stand your ground and never ever take from anyone. Be proud of yourself, who you are, where you come from, your name, your accent. Don't let anyone take that away from you.
Thank you so much, FAME Collective team. Excellent video, and we have been able to capture a huge number of voices, and some of the messages are such inspiration to all of us. So now we're going to move on to our breakout rooms. I just want to quickly remind everyone that the breakout rooms and what we discuss in the breakout rooms are going to be kept confidential, and we will not be sharing your names or your identity or publish any of the breakout rooms videos. So please, we hope that this facilitates an honest and open discussion. Please join in, and you'll be allocated to move on to the breakout rooms. And don't forget the poll, please. If you have a moment, please complete the poll. Thank you. And we'll see you back here at 10 to 8, please. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed sharing your experiences and discussions, and were able to ask any questions to the speakers directly, because I think we've run out of time for Q&A. So I'd like to quickly hear from each of the breakout rooms. So if I could first ask Marsha for your breakout room summary, please, that'd be appreciated.
Sure. So I think, a shared experience was around simply not being listened to, feeling that tutors were deliberately sidelining, and there's a sense of judgment from being from the outside, and the way that you look being a barrier, especially if you look younger than you are, which actually those of us of underrepresented racialized groups tend to, sorry, my camera keeps on flicking off, have the benefit of looking younger than
we don't crack.
Exactly. But also it's one of those double-edged swords, isn't it? Because it can bite us on the bottom in terms of the way we're treated, and those of us who have children, there's an expectation around having to juggle that, but being a student and being a parent is also problematic, because tutors don't expect students to be parents, and therefore don't do anything to help that situation. During COVID, that has been an extra barrier. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding of who can be a student, which needs to be addressed as well. So some really interesting thoughts, which certainly I'll be taking away to contemplate in the work that I'll be doing.
Thank you, Marsha. Now, if we can move to Manije from your group, please.
Sure. We had a both uplifting and a kind of depressing conversation in our room, in that people shared some really incredible research projects that they're working on. both personal research, but also through journals and inviting kind of different voices to contribute. And we had a really interesting discussion about how do we empower different voices to feel as though they can contribute, and make sure that those voices are heard, and different barriers that are preventing that from happening right now, and maybe new formats that need to be invented. We also heard about people being told that their research is irrelevant or maybe not interesting because it's not necessarily something that their tutor knew a lot about, or felt like they could contribute to, and they were encouraged to not research it, and like finding the resilience and the courage to continue was really inspiring to hear about. And also like how to find role models that you can identify with and that maybe can point you in the direction of resources to continue that research. And yeah, I think then there was also discussion on like kind of this how to get like a kind of wider group involved in the efforts of FAME, specifically maybe because the AA is hosting this tonight, how to get more AA people involved. And so that was really a great note, I think, to end on, because I guess by us hosting or co-hosting this event, I hope it's the beginning of a long collaboration and that more of our staff and students can participate going forward.
Definitely, yes. We welcome as many people to join us as possible, regardless of your race or your gender. We have to work together to make a change. So please contact us and join us. Okay, so yeah, thanks very much for the Manijay. And I think we're going to move on to Tanya. Would you like to give a summary of your breakout room?
Yeah, sure. So interestingly, we ended up actually discussing quite a bit about office environments, because some of the people in the group were sharing sort of office-related experiences and this idea of the imposter syndrome, because so in a way it made me think about, where all change is happening and where all it needs to happen, I guess, everywhere. So there was that. So there was this idea of imposter syndrome and whether decolonization, all the debates which are becoming very active and we are sort of gathering together and coalescing as groups and all. It's sort of natural here, whereas somewhere else, can you discuss decolonization, or can you discuss some of those other activities you may be involved in and things like that? And one thing that was also interesting is that a few of the people in our group were actually taught by two really interesting ethnic minority architect educators. And they said that, the experience was great and the relationship was completely different. So really goes to show how much of a difference that can make. These were mostly the type of questions. And there was this, someone framed it as, do I deserve to do architecture, or does architecture really need me? These sort of questions of whether I'm fit enough for it, or does this field need me, or would I be better used somewhere else? So relationships with fields and disciplines and all is sort of coming into question. It seemed to be interesting. And
yes, thank you, Tanya. Yes, we found that too in our research, that a lot of ethnic minority students drop out from part 1 to part 2 because they find themselves doing much better in medicine, engineering, and other fields. So definitely a very important question one of your participants has raised. Yes. Okay, so we're going to move on to Felicity. Thank you, Felicity.
Yeah, we had quite a personal discussion, I guess, from the talk. And we really touched on the idea of perhaps the environment that you as a person wanted to do architecture come from, and how those might be unseen barriers in a way, so barriers from within. We also talked mostly about mental health, and the role that, the correlation between poor mental health and doing architectural courses in the built environment. And I think one of the things I'm certainly going to take away is the idea that tutors and students really need training in terms of recognizing when those issues come to the fore and how to help students, or in fact, minimize the possibility of that happening. And yeah, it was just a really interesting and salutary moment as a possible solution to the idea. Yeah. I don't know if I've missed anybody else who was there, but those are what I took from it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, we also discussed bullying and the effects it has on mental health of students. But I won't speak about mine just yet. I'm going to move on to Constance's breakout room. Constance, would you like to volunteer someone, or would you like to summarize?
I think I can summarize that quite quickly. We had a very good session. I think everybody had a very good session. I learned a lot, and I was actually quite shocked to learn that some of the things being said to people in my breakout room that were half my age and then some were exactly the same things that were said to me 2.5 decades ago. And I'm like, what? You know, the world have moved on, and these dinosaurs are still mouthing the same sorts of prejudices and limitations. And so I thought, well, obviously, we had a very fiery session, and I said, just ignore that. So I think in a way we moved on to the sort of, probably the kind of motto for us. I mean, for me, was you can't be what you can't see. But I think all of us became what we couldn't see anyway. And to the newer generation, I would say just focus on constructing your own narrative, because, the kind of to have fame and to have the resources available, it's already a step up. And how quickly this trajectory can go is completely up to you guys and up to us. And I think one of the questions that probably someone already raised was, how do we reach out more and have mentors and people to talk to, like the people in fame, but probably more frequently when you actually have questions, or when someone said something to you and you're like, I know that's not right, but, probably someone else I would like to speak to about it. Yeah, so I think, that's from our group.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I think from our group, I'd like to volunteer Nabiha to summarize, if that's okay. Nabiha, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So we had quite a range of perspectives in our group. We had some students, two educators and one student. And the students spoke about their experience in architecture school, where a lot of the demographic of the students were people of color and women, but the actual educators weren't. So when it came to their education, it didn't reflect the people that attended. And it kind of does go to show that even when we are able to diversify the student cohort, we're not able to do the same with the education as well. And then when we heard from the architects, practitioners, and educators, they spoke about sort of this culture of bullying that occurs in education, and even so, after so many years of being an educator, it still occurs. We have mental health awareness, we have diversity, sort of a group that try to change this, but it still happens quite often. And one person who has been working has been working towards equalizing architecture for many years, talks about it being a marathon, not a sprint. And it just does go to show that even after many years of working towards diversifying, we still sort of need to be the backbone of this change, and we still need to work towards making our voices heard, and trying to change not just education but practice, who teaches us, diversifying the staff at architecture schools, diversifying the curriculum, making sure that it's representative of the students that study there. So there's still a lot to do, and it is really up to us to be the backbone of this change.
Thanks, Nabia. So we are going to try and end the session. Yep.
I just wanted to add one point which I forgot to mention, and I think it's important somehow, is that one of the points that came up was about someone who works in an office and joined back after the pandemic and found that it had become less diverse. And in a way, the attrition that has happened over the pandemic, who took the hit for it? It can be a coincidence, but these are questions that that actually do somehow seem to be wanting to be asked.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, and it's good that these questions are being raised here, because then we can document them and present them to institutions and bodies such as RIBA and the ARB. So now, I'm really sorry, but we've run out of time. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to give us their closing remarks. And I'm going to start with Marsha, who had to leave. And here's her statement that she's requested that I read out. So this is what Marsha says. I've had to leave to spend time with my family who do not have me with them during the week, as I work in London most days and I live in Derby. It's been a privilege to be able to listen to the voices sharing their stories this evening. I hope you already have an understanding that I hear and I appreciate these stories. And I'm cognizant that we have intersectional needs in architecture education. The narratives shared are exactly the input we need to help push the agenda. How we can attract people into the profession, how we can support students, the content of curricula, and how we navigate the relationships with schools of architecture and practices. I'm working on these different areas, and I'm happy to hear from anyone who has anything to add. Please reach out to me and to the RIBA. Please reach out to me at the RIBA via LinkedIn or Twitter. So that's a statement from Marsha. So I'm going to go around and ask each of the speakers just to summarize in one sentence and to give their final remarks before we close the session. So maybe I'll start with you, Tanya, because you spoke last. So go ahead, please.
Okay, so essentially, you guys are doing incredible work, actually, and I can't tell you how valuable it is. Data would be very important for us. And qualitative data, I've always been feeling, and I keep saying it on a lot of the platforms in my own institution, that we need to work from both a kind of an academic and intellectual understanding and a kind of ground up lived experience, because lived experience gives us actually bigger issues. It's extremely, and you're trying to gather that and capture that, the value of it. I mean, those statements from people were so telling. It's fantastic, and I think I've really learned a lot, and would like to know in greater detail, and hoping to read what you actually finally gather and put up. Absolutely. And also this whole idea of connecting with multiple organizations at multiple stages gives all of us a chance to think of it as a bigger community. Critical mass is very important, is very, very important.
Thank you, Tanya. We really appreciate your time and contribution to this event. So I'm going to move on to Constance, because I think she spoke before Tanya, so I'm just going in reverse order.
Okay, no, I think I echo what Tanya said, and it's really sort of, there was always a consciousness about what I do and how I do things, but this event today, has sort of created another level of awareness, and how I can further contribute with what I do and how I do it is probably something that I will reflect on. And so I think, congratulations and very well done to the people who are running this initiative.
Thanks, Constance. Thanks for your support. So next we're moving on to Felicity.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to hear the individual voices. And as always, I say it's about the individual. And the individual has power if it can tell its truth. And if education is able to treat each person as an individual, then probably most of the conversations we're having here wouldn't be necessary. But it is necessary. And I would say, for me, my takeaway is the sort of encouragement, but also to say to myself or acknowledge to myself that probably I won't be able to do half the things I want to do, and it's going to be okay too. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. Thank you again for your support. So now we're going to, I think we've come to the end. I think it's my turn now. I think we've gone around everyone. So yeah, this is my closing remark. So we as Fame Collective really hope to grow stronger. And we really thank everyone who supported us in the last year or so. And we would like to be stronger together to provide the much needed support for each other, especially for female architects or minority ethnic, to overcome the barriers of racial, gender inequality, both in academia and in practice. And we hope to inspire others to come forward and to join us in our discussions about their experiences of inequality in architecture. And yeah, so I'd like to end by saying thanks to our audience. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy and your participation in our breakout rooms. Also, a massive thank you to the AA team, Manijay and Raj, and the team behind really making this happen. And thanks to Marsha and the RIBA. And how can I not thank all the Fame Collective individuals who are so selfless and who give up all their free time to make these kind of things, events happen, and also to really give out a powerful message through our social media, through our research, that, you know, change will happen hopefully together. So thank you again so much. I'm going to hand over to Manijay to end the session. Thanks, Manijay.
I guess there's really not a lot more for me to add. I really agree with everything that everyone said before. I found this evening so inspiring, just listening to everybody's contributions and also realizing how much of our lived experiences connects us and how much still needs to change. So I feel really fortunate to have been able to be part of tonight's event, and also to hear about the important work that Fame is doing. I thought the video summarizing the survey was really incredible, and I can't wait to see what else you do. From the perspective of the AA, I guess I'd also just like to remind people to please come to our Thursday evening lectures on the New Models series, which is really trying to propose models like that change the way society is currently organized and address issues of systemic injustice. And we've had an incredible lineup over the last year, and this term's lineup is even more exciting. As I mentioned at the beginning, Tumpa is giving a lecture in December, but next week we have Sumitha Singha, who is the keynote of a previous edition of the symposium. So please do join us. You can find all the details on the AA website. But for now, have a lovely weekend, and thank you so much for staying and chatting with us.